Hello, I'm Emma Louise Coffey and you're welcome to The Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. With farmers still recovering from the long summer drought, I caught up with dairy specialist Joe Patton to discuss winter diets. But first, I asked him about the current fodder deficit across the country.
The national situation has changed a bit for the better in the last 4 or 5 weeks with the good weather, but we still see, significant deficits, and that's to be remembered. So, overall, I suppose the national picture is that maybe in the southeast, so I suppose South Leinster and the drier parts of Munster, we're looking at farms there reporting maybe a typical deficit of maybe 20 to 25% based on our recent survey. And that's common across actually larger scale, smaller scale dairy farms and dry stock farms also. So it's a pretty average figure across everything. Now further north and west, I suppose, into the sort of Connacht Ulster area, maybe North Leinster as well, those areas seem to be reporting on farms that have deficits. They're reporting deficits of maybe somewhere between 10 and 15%. So, and that maybe, in those areas that has improved a good bit in the last couple of weeks. There's been a lot of silage made and a lot of progress made on that. So that's the general run of it. Is kind of, I suppose, something like 20% in the southeast on average, maybe, and more like sort of 10% maybe at this stage in the more northern areas.
And, farmers have actively taken measures to reduce the demand on farms. They've culled empty or problem cows. Are there any other actions that farmers are doing and can do to reduce the feed demand for the winter?
Okay, so what can they do to reduce feed demand? I suppose the main point we really need to emphasise at the moment is that, we've had a good 4 or 5 weeks of weather. I know in some areas maybe still remain a bit too dry, but in the grand scheme of things, I suppose things have been quite benevolent. So what would concern me slightly is that people might think that has been enough to solve the problem. Do you know what I mean? That they have sort of said, well, we're okay now, and things will work themselves out. So I think the first thing we really need to be emphasising that people do need, from this week on, there's really not going to be much more silage made at this stage. So really, we know at this stage what the supply is going to be, and really to get a proper handle on that and measure that out and budget that out for the year. So that's the main thing, that move away from the idea that it's sort of everything's going to be all right and put some numbers on it. So once that's done, then I suppose we look down and see what the options are to maybe reduce demand in the first instance. So obviously, taking out your cull cows early is one thing that we've all talked about. I know a lot of people will say that there's money to be made in milking those cows on and finishing them on and whatever else. But if the situation at farm level is very tight for feed, it might be easier to sort of forego that. The other option, of course, is maybe to look at options around maybe getting some young stock wintered somewhere else, in a different yard for the winter time, somebody that might have feed available or might have an opportunity. That in some cases people are looking at those options. Maybe that could be renting sheds and putting them on silage, or maybe some tillage farms with forage crops sown might be interested in getting those grazed. So getting young stock out of the yard is a big one. And then obviously the final one then is looking at feeding some additional supplementary feed, additional concentrate, maybe to reduce the total amount of silage fed per cow per day.
And I suppose then when we look at, you mentioned the young stock, and, it's not just cows that we have in the yard to feed, but if we look at the demand of each of our groups of stock on the farm, firstly our dry cows, typically what amount of feed does a dry cow need, as standard?
Well, look, they're going to need, if you look at it in sort of dry matter terms, you're looking at anywhere between 11 to 12 kilos dry matter per day. So that really translates into about 50 kilos of silage per cow per day, thereabouts. So scale that up, you're talking about 1.5 tons per month. You're about 1.5 tons per month, ballpark figure for your dry cows, and you're looking at something like probably 70% of that, maybe 1.2 ton, maybe for your in-calf heifers, and something like 700 or 800 kilos for your, maybe 700 kilos total for your young stock per month. So that's your kind of 700, 1,200 and 1,500 kilos per month. So, if you can get if you can maybe get your young stock removed or get them wintered in a different way, that can be a big help. It could be enough to close the gap. Or maybe the solution is to maybe drop your drop your dry cow silage intake by maybe 20%, 30%, which would save you, that's going to save you 15 kilos of silage per cow per day, something like that. And that would have to obviously replace one for one. In terms of dry matter, anyway, it'll have to be replaced with something else. But that would be the scale of the options that you would probably be looking at,
So, where you do that and you replace some of the dry cow feed, say replace silage with supplement, or, you move the weanlings off farm for the winter period, for the areas kind of in the northern parts of the country, that would actually eliminate the deficit.
It essentially would, yeah. It essentially would. I think that the main thing to remember here is that if we can do something fairly significant, let's say through the months of November and December, but let's say a farm that's typically, let's say, short 15%, if they could do something for the months of November and December with dry cows, for those 6 or 7 weeks, if they could do something there in terms of, let's say, reduce your silage intake by 20%, 25%, say, that's going to go an awful long way to help and fix a problem. Because obviously dry cows, for your standard spring calving dairy herd, the dry cow requirement is obviously a big part of it's the majority part of the winter feed budget. So, I think what we have to do here is make sure that we take an action. So I think if we make one good decision for most farms, it'll solve the problem. So one good decision might be, I'm going to restrict silage to my dry cows for the months of November, December. I'm going to replace that with the appropriate amount of concentrate, restrict the silage, and then maybe look at my budget again in early to mid-January and see where I stand at that point. So rather than seeing this as being a huge sort of almost an insurmountable or a huge task ahead of us, if we can break it down and see which actions can get us as far as possible, as soon as possible, I think that's the way we should be looking at it.
And say, taking it a step further then, as we move south in the country, taking one or two of those actions isn't necessarily going to fill the deficit. And, if we have an average of 20 to 25% deficit, that means that some farmers have a more severe deficit. What sort of diets would you kind of advise for a farmer with a 25%, 30% deficit on farms, say, today?
Yeah, well, okay. So you take somebody in that situation, I think, look, the main thing in those cases, I know we can argue up and down about, the economics of milking on versus not milking on. But I think when you're, or holding on to cull cows, et cetera, to turn a cash margin on them, I think, in situations where you're, over 30% short, really has to be a priority to get the demand down. That makes a big difference. You'd be surprised, you'd save quite a bit of feed by offloading your cull cows early. So anybody that's facing into a 30% plus deficit, maybe up to 40%, at this stage really they should have their culls pretty much gone at this stage, where possible, because look, it'll help extend the autumn grass as well, and it'll help to extend the grazing rotation maybe for a couple of weeks, which will help so that's the first thing. In terms of the actual feed itself, look, for a lot of these farms, they are probably going to have to try and get their hands on and buy some long forage. So whether it's hay, there's plenty of hay around actually further north, I think, some silage as well, just to bring that, to try and pull some of that deficit back. Straw is quite expensive and hard to get, so the options around that are limited. So I suppose I should mention that too, that Teagasc are setting up and have set up a forage register. So farms around the country that might have surplus forage for sale, we're encouraging them to make contact with their local office to put that on register. So maybe farms that are in more severe deficit areas can, through their advisors, can avail of that. So there's going to have to be some effort, I'd say, made to bring in some long forage in those cases. But with all that said and done, and you take it right back to, let's say, if you can only afford to feed, let's say, for example, 4 kilos, 4 to 5 kilos dry matter of silage, you're looking at probably 4 or 5 kilos dry matter silage 3 kilos, in about 3 to 4 kilos actually of concentrate basically, which is going to have to be balanced for protein. So something like gluten and barley or gluten and hulls, 3 to 4 kilos of that, and the balance of that probably with an external long fiber source like 2 to 3 kilos of hay or straw. And that's the type of diet you're looking at. So, it really depends on the individual farmer, and we would be encouraging people to make contact with their advisor to work out the details of those diets really.
And then, like, finally, you've given us a picture of what the animal needs and the actions to take based on what sort of deficit you have on your farm. Can you give us your top tips of action farmers should take right now in their yard to prepare for the winter?
Okay, so like first thing, without question, measure the pits, count the bales, do a silage test as well, because dry matters in the pit could be anything from 20 to 27, 28%. So that'll make a big difference in terms of how much feed you actually have on hand. So, measure your pits, test your silage, and, get a second opinion if you need it to make sure you've calculated correctly. Second thing, any non-productive stock or any cull stock, take the hit, get rid of them. It'll make space and it'll reduce the budget. The third thing, take a walk around the yard and have a look and see, have you got 700 millimeters, so 0.7 of a meter basically of feed space per cow. So that's effectively enough, that's effectively 7 cows per standard bay in your standard sort of slatted shed type of arrangement. So you want to look at your feed space and see, have you got 700 mils of space per cow? Because if you're feeding restricted feed, you're going to need for at least twice a day, not the whole day, but at least twice a day, all cows are going to have to be able to feed at the one time. So, audit your feed space. If you're short, take some steps. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be nice, but take some steps to increase that. That could be round feeders in the yard. It could be feed trailers, whatever it might be. We've got about 4 or 5 weeks to figure that out. So that's the main things: is audit the amount of feed, get rid of the non-productive ones, measure your feed space, and make sure you have made plans to have enough for the cows, and then sit down and work out a feed plan or a daily routine that's going to work for you. That's a big part of it, because I think, Emily, is like part of this. Like we've done a lot of diets on paper, and we can mess around with energies and proteins and fibers up and down on a page, but when it comes to the reality, people have to go out and actually feed this out physically every day, and that's going to be quite difficult. So, making that as easy as possible is the main thing. So definitely get the feed space in place and get a good routine started early, so that you can make the savings as soon as possible.
And just to finally pick up, Joe, you mentioned the local advisor, and if you need to contact the local advisor for the fodder register, and also in terms of the winter feed budget and formulation of diets, the local advisor is available for all those things.
Absolutely. Like we've done a lot of work with advisors, and advisors have contributed a lot in terms of their ideas as well, that we've pull all our ideas together across the country, that people can have there's a good source of information there for farmers if they need some help with it. Like we've got a range of sample diets done out, balance for energy and protein, and look at, if you have your own sums done in terms of what silage you have, maybe a silage analysis done and your cow numbers done, that's the most important job our advisors will be doing over the next 6 months, is to make sure that, as many farmers as possible have a good plan worked out that they can make work. So definitely I'd be encouraging people to make contact, because there is good information there now at this stage. So by all means, lift the phone and give us a call.
That's great. Thank you, Joe.
Okay.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Joe Patton for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.